The flat tax that was talked about, has that been implemented anywhere? Do we have any data or evidence on how a flat tax would actually work?
Yeah, so first, a general disclaimer is that neither Eric nor I is the tax
Fair
expert
enough.
here,
Fair
but
enough.
so I believe the case is no, Sandra, that this is a relatively new and creative set of ideas from these two economists at Berkeley that is intended to be progressive and in ways that most other taxing arrangements haven't been. The other thing, though, to note, I think, is that none of these proposals has been implemented in quite this scale, nor for the purpose of raising funds broadly for healthcare. So, you know, there's an element of creative and groundbreaking thinking that may be required.
Well, the spirit of that question really was that, you know, I think given everything we're talking about with regard to the extraordinary burden that we put on middle income and low income families in particular, I don't think we ought to be looking at anything that is a regressive tax. That just seems to me to be counterintuitive to the overall goal here. And so if there are ideas for progressive taxes that haven't been modeled, I would encourage that we do some modeling of those to understand how they might work.
Yeah, so what I hear you, so first of all, thank you so much for kicking us off, Sandra. And
sorry about that, Marianne.
No, I greatly appreciate it.
I'm so.
And I think, you know, what we had hoped to maybe start with here and hear from each of the members of the commission is among these financing options, which one resonate with you? And what I think I hear from you, Sandra, is that that first principle around an equity, otherwise stated as not regressive, is an important principle for you. Hence, proposals that include that are worthy of consideration. Would other members of the commission like to weigh in on any of the proposals or on general observations?
Yeah, I would love to second what Sandra said, that it feels like income tax, with all the wealth in California, especially the wealth of our industries, should really be the last thing. Taxing just middle and low income folks who are already taxed so severely. And I also just think that, you know, we are home to the Elon Musks of the world, the Apples of the world, the Googles of the world, these corporations that have more money than some small nations. And I think we should be looking at how to get some of that money, redistribute some of that wealth from those corporations back into the workers of California who made that wealth, who've been involved in making that wealth. Also people who've been impacted and displaced through these industries. So I see this opportunity with the financing of this system as being a real opportunity to enact historic reparations to Black and Brown and poor communities, working class communities. And so I think that we should be as creative as we possibly can. Again, the wealth tax, I would love to see that up there. And then the gross receipt tax scaled with regards to how harmful an industry, if we have data, in which we have plenty of data about the toxicities of various industries, those things should be front and center in the discussion. And I'm thinking about that right now with regards to COVID and air pollution. So we've now seen several studies come out showing that air pollution not only impacts how COVID spreads in communities, but how people die. And so those industries should be taxed because those people are ending up in the hospital, whether or not they have health insurance. And so it puts we're seeing the externalization of profit on the public of California. So we should hit those industries that are profiting off of our suffering.
Thank you, Commissioner Maria. I wonder if another member of the commission would like to weigh in on these options and especially how the criteria apply.
So this, Peter Lee, I'll weigh in a couple of ways. Is one, just to really strongly affirm Sandra's global point, which is, of the various 7 factors, to me, equity is by far the most important, and it should be a key test. To my mind, that means, and I appreciate it also within the options described, how to address elements that may or may not be progressive by having things like exempting the first $20,000 of income. And I think that should be a key element of any of these. So it's not just which are things that are regressive, like sales and use taxes are very regressive. Income, a payroll tax may or may not be regressive depending on how it's structured. And so the issues of looking at what is inherently progressive and what could be made progressive. The other element that I just want to echo from the earlier discussions in the entire group is to affirm the need to look at costs. We know that, and that's a big issue. But I really thought that, and I know it's hard to talk about politics in these sessions because it's all so political, but I thought Anthony's point was a really important one. In the end, there is no criteria here for what would make this more doable. Doability is a matter of taking things to the public for a vote, to the legislature, and that's not just about these issues. It's this about how many oxes do we gore in which ways to then make something surfable through very rough seas. And so I really like a lot of Rupa's ideas she's brought up, and how many of those do we pick up to bring more opposition in some ways that we may want to dodge. And so I think that they're incredibly important mixes of how do we look at these, whatever the mix is, what's going to get the best sort of political engagement and buy-in.
Thank you, Peter. Would Sarah Phlox perhaps wish to weigh in?
Yes, please. So I would definitely echo Commissioner Hernandez on we need to find the absolutely most progressive way to put together financing. I actually wanted to start with the question of savings. So let's go through our existing tax code and find all of the tax breaks, especially corporate tax breaks, and close them. I mean, we have a ridiculous R&D credit that is incredibly wasteful. And let's get a real assessment of where money is flowing out, close it, bring it in. The other savings is, can we get an estimate of how much we would save in CalPERS in terms of providing healthcare? Our retiree healthcare is one of our largest unfunded liabilities right now. So the savings on that side. I definitely agree with a wealth tax. I think I would look at something, how do we control the volatility and maybe have a capital gains tax that we put in a lockbox, like a rainy day fund, the inheritance tax, maybe a digital download tax, a luxury tax. I think a lot of those things of different ways to get to wealth is very important. I know that we can't redirect property tax, but it would be interesting to see that if we did split roll and had more of a commercial property tax, can there be any backfill where we save in the general fund? Because I do worry about having too lopsided of a tax system where we only have an income tax and everything else is, is where people aren't paying property tax. And then the other piece I think that for us is especially important is making sure as part of the financing that the money that is freed up to employers by what they're saving on healthcare goes into wages, because those wages are going to translate into increased revenue for the state overall. And so that for us is a key part of the financing piece as well. Like workers need to get back all of the money that they've lost and all the raises that they've had to give up because of the cost of healthcare.
Thank you very
Marion,
much.
this is Sandra. Could I just pile on something here for a moment?
Yes.
I'm incredibly skeptical of this concept of a rainy day fund. If the COVID epidemic didn't disclose to us just how fast a rainy day fund can completely vanish into the red, we would be remiss not to recognize that. And that sort of builds into a broader theme, which is, any program that is funded in a counter-economic cycle is at risk of contracting when the economy goes down for whatever reason. And then the program cuts follow. So we should learn from what and how we finance Medi-Cal and Medicaid. These are counter-cyclical economic programs in the way that they're financed, and really undermines the notion that when people most need care, you want to make sure you have the resources in that system to be able to sustain it.
I just want to respond to Sandra's great points there. The COVID fund, rainy day fund, disappeared also at a time where healthcare insurance companies are making record profits during COVID, while I got, all my colleagues got pay cuts through the UC system and nurses are being laid off. So I think that we have to understand, if when we're talking about creating a new financing structure, we can't be applying the old one if we're going to be imagining something new.
Thank you. Let me ask if Ginny Chin Hansen, might you want to jump in here?
Sure, thank you. I think that I have two P's, so to speak. One is on the principle, which I think Sandra kicked off elegantly, and many of us concur, and I certainly do, and that is, I think given the range of disparity of income and wealth right now, the idea of not harming folks, if in the opposite, making sure that we move toward a more closing of that disparity. So, some of the things that were laid out in the 7 points did more or less, but certainly bringing up people who are at the lowest income, and then preserving the strength and possibility of the middle income. So that moves toward the focus on areas of wealth that really don't, unfortunately, provide a societal good as a part of its efforts. I think the loophole taxes that were brought up by Mara is really important to see that these things that don't, basically are just safety valves for ways that money can be tucked away for those who have money, should be really looked at. The other thing is, I also, by virtue of my whole background, I have a pragmatism streak. So Peter, when you brought up the question of where do we choose to have our battles, but battles must be had. But I think some very, deep thinking strategically and tactically as to which of those areas we really should, quotes, be more focused on retrieving back. And the last comment I'll make is I've been, like many of you, and some of you already expressed, very perturbed by the wealth of the health plans during this time of pandemic. And, just even on the face of it, that is just so wrong when people are losing. So however we can close that huge disparity and to, basically trade on profit only for shareholders versus using money that has been collected tax-wise for the public good.
Thank you so much. So I'm curious to hear from Andy Schneider, and maybe particularly, Andy, I'm sure you have many great thoughts, but particularly maybe back to Peter's and Anthony Wright's comment about sort of the combination of what's right and what's politically feasible. Of course, you want, I'm sure, to maximize both, but your thoughts just in response to any of this.
Yeah, you're reading my mind, Marian. So this reaction comes from having spent a lot of time over the course of my career in getting stuff through the Congress. Mm-hmm. And the Congress is not, the California legislature. I'm not going to pretend it is, but there are some similar dynamics. And one of them is, how much can you carry. Just how many issues can you take on? How many different constituencies? Personally, I would recommend not turning this into an exercise in tax reform, and just thinking about, and that's not to say that tax reform isn't necessary. I'm just saying I would encourage us to focus on, can we come up with a recommendation on financing that is adequate to the task, that is going to be stable over the business cycles, that is simple so people can understand it, and it's harder to manipulate and it's harder to game, and that it's not regressive.
Mhm.
So I agree with Sandra, but I think it's asking a lot to come up with something that's progressive, as well as adequate and stable and simple. But again, this is, from 3,000 miles away and coming from a different political construct. But there are clearly some trade-offs here. I would just think long and hard about how many different fights you want to take on with this.
Thanks, and I'm sure there are responses. Yes,
Yeah,
please.
in response to that, so if we're talking about health equity and we live in a society where there is medical apartheid, which is what I see every day in the hospital at UCSF, we have to talk about restructuring broadly systems of power. So if that means getting very creative to our legislators and giving them a view of tax structure that's completely different, we're talking about restructuring our society. That's what we are talking about on this commission, if we're talking about health equity. There was a language used in the report that said increasing health equity. You don't get some health equity. It's not like a proportion of thing. Either you have health equity or you don't have health equity. And right now we don't have health equity. And the only way we're going to get it is through very deep transformation of our economic system, and to create space for, to move money, redistribute wealth, so that people who don't have it right now can have access to the things that come with wealth, and health is one of those. One thing I forgot to mention is that in the next 10 years, looking forward, we are going to have to rebuild as a state, as a country. The next 10 years in the face of recovering from COVID, and our estimates that we're seeing in the hospital is 2022, perhaps the next 10 years we're living with this virus. Our whole world is being restructured right now in front of our eyes, and we have to start thinking creatively. And one of the things I was thinking is there a way to design in California law to preemptively imagine those industries that will come and make lots of money off of California through the rebuilding of our infrastructure, whether it's moving the greening of California, whether it's getting off of fossil fuels. There's industries that are being imagined right now that will come online in the next 10 to 15 years that are of the moment, that we need to start thinking, how do we capture that wealth so it doesn't just escape into some offshore account like Apple and Google. So how can we create those, like Sandra and Ginny was mentioning, just close those loopholes preemptively.
Thank you so much. So oh, go ahead, Ginny, was that?
No.
Or is that? No, sorry. Sarah, I'm kind of curious to hear maybe you react to some of these thoughts around the combination of the aspirations and the outcomes, particularly around equity, that are desirable, and the path to a viable financing approach, or any other comment you might want to make at this point.
Okay, I mean, I think going back to the kind of political question and the political will question, I think the political will around what financing is possible, what we're able to get in terms of what taxes would be acceptable, is partly on how much does the system cost. And so we also have to have the political will to do some serious work around controlling costs in the system, in terms of, okay, are we getting rid of insurance companies? We have the savings there. That's not enough. We need to look at the prices, and this is in the environmental scan, the prices that are being charged, how much money the healthcare industry is making. how much hospitals are making, how much providers are making, certain providers, how much waste there is. And so if we are willing politically to do the hard cost containment, because you're going up against the entire healthcare industry, then that's going to reduce the overall cost and make it easier to swallow whatever financing plan. And so I think the two are linked, and we have to have them together. And I think this was the challenge. I think Dr. Wood alluded to this in Vermont, is that if you're telling legislators, well, every year you're going to have to vote for a tax increase because every year the healthcare system is going to increase, they're going to have a hard time doing it. But it's easier if you're actually saving a lot of money.
Thank you so much. Jenny Chen Hansen, you wanted to get in?
I just wanted to join you on the whole pricing issue. Because I think we all know how extraordinary our prices is to other similar type of countries. So one of the areas is this example of perhaps using the power of, say, the CalPERS that has set prices, reference pricing, and to be able to talk about things that like they've done for hip surgeries. They basically based a flat price based on knowledge that they have of where the efficiencies can be gained, but we should be able to kind of look at the most efficient provider with high quality and begin to shape that so we can, and especially if there's large buying power, to be able to kind of navigate those kinds of expectations of providers to gradually price adjust to a more, quotes, reasonable way to do it without sacrificing what good quality would be about.
Yeah. So Peter, unmute.
Yeah, well, thank you. One of the things that I want to look at all of these, it sort of was raised in some of the background material, and it relates to both equity and do no harm. And I know I'm playing at odds with my note about political reality and what plays, but the concept of requiring what was compensation in the form of healthcare to be translated into the form of compensation as compensation. It's whatever, it's not about the revenue for the healthcare side, but it's part about the justice of what we're doing here. And so I think that's a really important element to have. And with that, and I know Rick Cronick isn't here with us today, but I do have a question to him that I'll forward to him, is that given the $100 million of employer premium is all to the benefit of employees, but somewhere 30% of it is from foregone federal taxes because it's tax-free. And just recognizing the federal tax benefit of this, that where employers aren't going to write a check for that because it's taxed other places. So I guess that's just an element. But my main point is when we think about equity and do no harm, part of the equity of this is to, I don't trust that many employers will say, oh, okay, this was part of our comp, I'm going to carry it across. Raising that bar, though, does raise political opposition, just to acknowledge that reality as well. So.
Right, I appreciate that. And I think a real challenge is how do you get the commitment, from the federal government to give back that money, or from employers to do the right thing, or whatever it might be. Sandra, did I see you maybe wanting to get in again?
Yeah, Marion, I just wanted to add to the conversation with regard to the notion that I can't imagine any of these scenarios for additional revenues when we have really unconstrained prices in so many ways. So this notion of having a meaningful way to purchase and pay for high quality, culturally appropriate, at the right place type of care, value-based care, if you will. We have got to have some way of controlling costs, or all of these tax structures, I think, ultimately fail on the political need to keep going back to the well. I definitely think the conversation with regard to what that would look like or what the target would be for that and build that into these models of revenue would be very helpful.
Thank you. Additional comments, and let me also encourage, if there are additional questions for Rick Cronick or more broadly that you think really should factor into future conversations, we'd certainly welcome those. I'm hearing loud and clear this connection between the way we spend the money and the way we raise the money, and appreciate that very much. Other comments? Jenny.
I have one more, and this is actually showing up in our work on the other state program on planning that I mentioned, is the Master Plan for Aging.
Mm-hmm.
And it was somewhat alluded to here in our earlier discussion about social determinants. You know, we have medicalized so much, and actually, as a result, added price to the medicalization of what should be basic health stability, and you know, having enough money for nutrition, having enough money for shelter and things like this. So this is an area, and I just got off a call this morning from work on the NCQA, the National Forum for Quality, and the ability to start testing, I know, what is quality when you consider what's important to people and social-based factors. I mean, it's not by any stretch ready for prime time, but I think we often know now that the public health discussion has emerged finally again about what constitutes health. And then, you know, when one has, quotes, health, especially those elements that are more shapeable by behaviors, costs can go down. You know? And so that is that last number 7 for him on health behaviors, is that it's not just medical health behaviors, it is lifestyle shape, which again, we know is difficult, but I know the Master Plan for Aging is beginning to tackle that. So it's just another angle, as well as coming from the national quality measurement perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Marion, if I could, there's a corollary to what Jenny was just speaking to, which is we ought to be very mindful that in any new revenue or tax structure, we don't continue to pull dollars away from public education and other social programs, because what we end up doing, of course, is paying for that in a delivery system, which is quite expensive. So as we think about these revenue streams, we ought to make sure they don't completely suck through the dollars that are supporting other very vital programs that low-income communities need much better access to.
Indeed, and thank you. I appreciate both those comments very much. And I had a thought, but I lost it. So I'm hoping somebody else will. Ruba, yes, thanks.
Sorry, I just wanted to piggyback on what both Sandra and Jenny said, that there's something about the individual health behaviors that I'm a little concerned about, because how to say this, so much of what we're talking about with healthcare, social determinants of health, is truly structural. It's the inability to get food without pesticides all over it. It's the inability to have safe housing where you're not going to be evicted. Like right now, throughout California, all these people are getting evicted as we're sitting here meeting. Understanding that homelessness and eviction ends up being another determinant of health. And so I just wonder if there's a way of keeping our framework on the structures, the corporate structures, the social structures that are undermining health for our people, rather than the individual.
Thank you.
So, Marion?
Yes, Peter.
If I could, again, in applauding Sandra's point, I think this is a good example to me of I think the criterion, to my mind, of do no harm isn't a bad criterion. It's just a matter of defining what are the examples of things that fall in within that criterion. And that's a great example of, be careful that the revenue used isn't revenue that is offsetting revenue that is needed to be used for other state-based funded priorities, such as education, et cetera. And to me, that's, I just thought Sandra did a really articulate example of boy, if we use revenue that was already used in other places and it takes away from those, that's doing harm. And that's just a great example. I just wanted to put a yellow highlighter on that, fitting in with what I thought is a criteria that could work if we're defining it right.
Yes, thank you. And I think the thought that all this spurs for me, and and we're at about 3 minutes, so if there are any comments that could tie this up in a beautiful package, I'd love it, is sort of the scope and the focus of the kinds of reforms you're looking at. Because I hear, you know, really restructuring the tax code, the balance of wealth through some of these changes. I hear about deciding the way that you pay. I hear about deciding and reforming the way that that you invest in people's health. And I think clearly the ambition and the goal would be to do all those things, but I wonder if any of you have thoughts about how you pull it all together or where you start with the kinds of reforms that all of you I know truly wish.
I am
Sarah.
definitely not going to tie it up in a ribbon at all, but I do think going to the point that's been made a number of times about not taking away from other programs, which is so incredibly important to the state overall and to health. I do think, and this is going to go against what everyone said about politics, but I do think we have to look at our entire tax system and reform it, because everything is going to get crowded out. So you need to think about, like, if we want to fund our schools, we have to reform property tax. We need to have a real property tax going in to fund our local schools, and some kind of other progressive or not regressive tax to be able to fund all the other social programs and a single payer system. And so we need to look across all the different, the sales tax, the corporate tax, the income tax, property tax, and figure out how that system works as one tax system to fund all the priorities that we have. And that's incredibly challenging and huge. But I think when we're thinking about having a single payer system and how transformational that is for our state, part of it is at least looking at the entire tax structure so that it funds all of the priorities that we have.
Thank you. Other closing comments? We're at about a minute here now.
And Marion, if I could just jump in,
please, Eric.
I want to make sure we note that we have less than a minute remaining. Is there any other thing that people would raise within this category of additional information you would like to see? Because this is your opportunity to really say, as you did earlier, what ideas do we have on a flat tax and how that might work and the impact, other ideas of progressive taxes that we haven't mentioned and how they could be modeled. Are there other specific information that you'd like to see?
I want to see how much wealth is in the tech industry in California and how much we could just tax. I want to see, like, the big ticket items in California mentioned. There's big ticket items here. It's where we're like wealthier than most nations. I want to see those things taxed. I want to stop talking about income tax and visions of tax that are not going to fundamentally redistribute the wealth to attend to what's needed. So I feel like what we've heard so far is quite conservative.
Okay, so and Marion is noting that we're now at 0 hour and we're going to be returning to the big group momentarily.
Thank you all.